May 1, 1958, Red Square, Moscow. The rumble of diesel engines echoed off the Kremlin walls as a new machine rolled past the reviewing stand where Nikita Khrushchev stood watching. The T-54, soon to be designated the T-55 after modifications, represented the pinnacle of Soviet armored engineering. 100 tons of steel, powered by a 520 horsepower engine, armed with a 100mm rifled cannon. The crowds cheered. The Western military attachés took notes, and in the Soviet General Staff there was absolute confidence. This was the tank that would dominate any battlefield, overwhelm any enemy, secure any objective. 9 years later, in the scorching deserts of Sinai and the volcanic hills of the Golan Heights, that confidence would be shattered in just 6 days. The story of the Six-Day War is often told as a tale of Israeli air superiority, of lightning strikes and brilliant generals. But beneath the drama of aerial combat and infantry assaults lies a more fundamental question. What happens when the most produced tank in human history, backed by Soviet military doctrine and Arab numerical superiority, encounters an enemy that refuses to fight by the rules? What happens when quantity meets quality, when mass production meets precision training, when Cold War arrogance meets desperate innovation? The answer would reshape Middle Eastern politics, redefine modern armored warfare, and prove that even the mightiest war machine is only as effective as the doctrine that guides it and the hands that control it. To understand how Israel destroyed or captured over 2,000 Arab tanks in less than a week, we must first understand what made the T-55 seem invincible. The T-54 medium tank entered Soviet service in 1949, just 4 years after the end of World War II. It was designed with the lessons of that conflict burned into its blueprints. Soviet engineers had watched Tiger tanks tear through T-34 formations at Kursk. They had seen German Panthers dominate the rolling plains of Ukraine. They had counted the cost of every engagement where Soviet quantity barely overcame German quality. The T-54 was meant to be different. It combined the sloped armor that had made the T-34 so difficult to penetrate with a more powerful gun, better optics, and improved crew ergonomics. By 1958, the upgraded T-55 variant incorporated features that Western tanks would not match for years. It was the first main battle tank in the world equipped with a nuclear, biological, and chemical protection system. Soviet planners assumed the next war would be atomic, and they designed accordingly. The T-55 could seal itself completely, filter outside air through specialized systems, and theoretically operate on an irradiated battlefield. Its 100mm D-10T cannon could penetrate 185mm of armor at 1,000 meters, more than sufficient to destroy any NATO tank of the era at combat ranges. The numbers told an impressive story. The T-55 measured just over 9 meters long with its gun forward, giving it a smaller profile than American or British heavy tanks. It weighed 36 tons, making it lighter and faster than its Western counterparts. Its low silhouette, just 2.4 meters tall, made it harder to spot and hit. The diesel engine gave it a range of 500 kilometers, far superior to the gasoline-powered American tanks that guzzled fuel. Soviet doctrine emphasized long-range advances, deep penetrations into enemy territory, and the T-55 was built for exactly that kind of warfare. But the most important number was production. Between 1958 and 1979, the Soviet Union and its client states would manufacture over 70,000 T-55 tanks. When you included the earlier T-54 variants, the total exceeded 100,000 units. No tank in human history had been produced in such numbers. Not the Sherman, not the T-34. The T-55 became the AK-47 of armored warfare, ubiquitous, reliable, and exported to virtually every Soviet ally on Earth. In 1965, Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser traveled to Moscow with a shopping list. The previous year, Israeli retaliatory raids had exposed the weakness of Egypt's military. NASA wanted modern equipment, advisors, training. The Soviets were happy to oblige. Supporting Arab nationalism served Soviet interests perfectly. It challenged Western influence in the Middle East, secured access to the Suez Canal, and demonstrated Soviet military superiority. Over the next 2 years, hundreds of tanks rolled off trains in Alexandria and Port Said. T-34-85s from World War II, Su-100 tank destroyers, and the crown jewels of the shipment, hundreds of T-54 and T-55 medium tanks. Syria received a similar influx. Jordan, though more aligned with the West, still fielded Soviet equipment alongside its British Centurions. By May 1967, the Arab states surrounding Israel possessed approximately 2,500 tanks. Egypt alone fielded over 950, including at least 500 T-55s. The mathematics seemed overwhelming. Israel possessed roughly 800 tanks, a 3-to-1 disadvantage. Soviet advisors arrived with the equipment. They brought their doctrine, their training manuals, their absolute confidence. The Red Army had defeated the Wehrmacht. It had crushed the Hungarian uprising in 1956 with brutal efficiency. Soviet military theory had evolved through decades of mechanized warfare, from the deep battle concepts of the 1930s to the nuclear doctrines of the Cold War. Egyptian and Syrian officers attended courses in Soviet military academies, learning to think like Soviet tank commanders. The doctrine they learned emphasized mass and momentum. Soviet tactics called for tank armies to advance in echelons, wave after wave, overwhelming enemy positions through sheer weight of metal. Individual tanks were expendable. Individual crews were replaceable. What mattered was maintaining the momentum of the offensive, pushing forward regardless of losses until the enemy collapsed. This had worked against the Germans, who had been forced to retreat from one defensive line to another, exhausting their limited reserves. Surely it would work against a tiny state like Israel. But there was a fundamental assumption built into Soviet doctrine, one so obvious that few questioned it. The doctrine assumed you would maintain air superiority. Soviet tanks were designed to operate under the protective umbrella of Soviet air power. Ground attack aircraft would suppress enemy anti-tank positions. Fighters would prevent enemy planes from strafing your columns. Helicopters would scout ahead and eliminate threats. The entire system depended on controlling the skies. In June 1967, that assumption would prove catastrophic. While Soviet tanks rolled into Egyptian depots and Syrian bases, a very different conversation was happening in Tel Aviv. Major General Israel Tal stood before a map of the Middle East, considering a problem that had consumed him for years. How does a small state with limited industrial capacity defeat larger enemies equipped with Soviet armor? Tal was not a typical general. Born in Palestine in 1924, he had fought in the Palmach strike forces before Israeli independence. He understood guerrilla warfare and conventional military theory with equal facility. After the 1956 Suez Crisis, where Israeli tanks had performed adequately but not brilliantly, he had been appointed to transform Israel's armored corps. He approached the task with the mind of an engineer and the ruthlessness of a man who knew his nation's survival depended on getting the details right. His first conclusion was unambiguous. After air power, tanks would decide the outcome of the next war. Infantry could hold ground, but only armor could take it. Artillery could soften defenses, but only tanks could exploit breakthroughs. In the flat deserts of Sinai and the rolling terrain of the Golan Heights, whoever controlled the armored battlefield would control the war. His second conclusion was more controversial. Israel could not win through quantity. The Arab states would always have more tanks, more men, more resources. Soviet military aid guaranteed that disparity would continue. Therefore, Israel had to win through quality. Every Israeli tank had to be worth 3 Arab tanks. Every Israeli crew had to outshoot, outmaneuver, and outthink their opponents. In 1965, Tal made a pilgrimage that would have seemed bizarre to anyone who didn't understand his thinking. He traveled to West Germany. There, he and his deputy Moshe Zamir met with former Wehrmacht officers who had fought on the Eastern Front. These men had faced Soviet armor in the vast spaces of Russia and Ukraine. They had commanded outnumbered panzer divisions against waves of T-34s. They had developed tactics born of desperation and refined through survival. What Tal learned was revelatory. The Germans explained that Soviet doctrine was predictable. Soviet tank commanders followed their training rigidly. They advanced in formation, maintained radio discipline to the point of radio silence, and relied on superior officers to make tactical decisions. Individual initiative was discouraged. Deviation from the plan was punished. This made Soviet armor powerful when executing set-piece offensives, but vulnerable to unexpected maneuvers. The Germans also emphasized something Tal already suspected. Crew training mattered more than tank specifications. A well-trained crew in an inferior tank would defeat a poorly trained crew in a superior tank almost every time. The Germans had won early battles in Russia not because their tanks were better. The T-34 was arguably superior to anything Germany fielded in 1941. But because German crews were superbly trained, German tactics were flexible, and German commanders were empowered to make decisions. Tal returned to Israel determined to create a tank corps that combined the best of German tactical flexibility with Israeli improvisation. He instituted brutal training regimens. Israeli tank crews spent hundreds of hours on gunnery ranges, firing until they could hit moving targets at maximum range. They practiced radio communication until coordination between tanks became second nature. They ran exercises in the Negev desert until every driver could navigate by the stars, every gunner could estimate range by eye, every commander understood how to exploit terrain. But training alone wouldn't be enough. Tal also needed the right equipment. Here, he made decisions that would prove crucial. Israel operated a bizarre mixture of tanks from different nations. American M48 Pattons, British Centurions, French AMX-13 light tanks, even old Sherman tanks from World War II. The question was which to prioritize. The AMX-13 was fast, agile, perfect for reconnaissance. But its light armor and small gun made it nearly useless against Soviet medium tanks. The Patton was solid, reliable, well-armed with a 90mm gun. But that 90mm was marginal against T-55 frontal armor. The Centurion was heavy, slower than the others, a logistics headache. But it had one critical advantage. In the late 1950s, Britain had developed a new tank gun. The Royal Ordnance L7, a 105mm rifled cannon, had been designed specifically to defeat Soviet armor. British intelligence had analyzed the T-54 and determined that existing NATO guns were inadequate. The L7 was the answer. It fired armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot rounds that could penetrate over 300mm of armor at 2,000 meters. That was enough to punch through a T-55 from any angle at combat ranges. Tal made his choice. Israel would upgrade its Centurions with the L7. The British tanks would become the Shot, Hebrew for whip. The Americans agreed to let Israel upgrade its Pattons with the L7 as well, replacing the marginal 90mm. Even the obsolete Sherman would be transformed, fitted with French 105mm guns, to create the M51 Super Sherman, a World War II relic reimagined as a tank destroyer. The result was an arsenal unified around a single principle. Every Israeli tank could kill a T-55 at ranges where the T-55's 100mm gun struggled to respond. The Soviet cannon had been adequate in 1958, but by the mid-60s, Israeli upgraded tanks with the L7 had a distinct range advantage. This would matter enormously in the wide-open spaces of Sinai. By May 1967, Israel possessed approximately 800 tanks, 260 Centurion Shots, 250 M48 Pattons, many upgraded, 175 Super Shermans, 180 AMX-13 light tanks. The remainder were older models, M4 Shermans, obsolete and dangerous to crew in a modern war. On paper, it looked inadequate against Arab numbers. But Tal had created something the Arabs didn't have: an armored corps where every crew was trained to a standard that exceeded most Soviet tank crews, where every main gun could engage effectively at 3,000 meters, where doctrine emphasized speed, flexibility, and aggressive exploitation of enemy mistakes. The stage was set: Soviet equipment and doctrine on one side, Israeli training and technology on the other. All that was needed was the spark. That spark came on May 15, 1967, when Egypt moved armored divisions into Sinai. Nasser's rhetoric had grown increasingly bellicose. He spoke of driving Israel into the sea, of reversing the humiliation of 1948. Syrian shelling of Israeli settlements from the Golan Heights had created a cycle of retaliation and counter-retaliation. Nasser ordered the United Nations peacekeeping force out of Sinai. Then, fatally, on May 22nd, he closed the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel considered the straits closure an act of war. The straits were Israel's only access to the Red Sea, the route to trade with Asia and Africa. But the closure also played into a trap Nasser didn't fully understand. By massing Egyptian armor in Sinai, he had created a target-rich environment in terrain that favored the defender. Soviet doctrine called for rapid offensives, but Nasser had placed his tanks in defensive positions, waiting for Israel to attack. He assumed Israeli forces would smash themselves against prepared Egyptian positions, just as Arab forces had broken against Israeli defenses in previous wars. He was wrong about nearly everything. June 5, 1967, 7:45 in the morning. The Israeli Air Force launched Operation Focus, the most ambitious airstrike in military history. Nearly the entire Israeli combat air fleet, roughly 200 aircraft, took off in waves. They flew low over the Mediterranean to avoid Egyptian radar, then turned south toward Egypt. The first wave struck Egyptian air bases just as morning patrols were landing, when Egyptian fighters were most vulnerable, refueling on the ground. The attacks were devastatingly precise. Israeli pilots didn't just bomb runways. They used a specific tactic: cratering the runway at both ends, trapping aircraft between the craters. Then they methodically destroyed the parked planes with cannon fire and rockets. Egyptian pilots ran toward their aircraft, only to watch them explode. Anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the sky, hitting nothing. Within 3 hours, the Israeli Air Force had destroyed over 300 Egyptian aircraft, roughly 90% of Egypt's combat air power. Syria, Jordan, and Iraq all sent token airstrikes against Israel. The Israeli Air Force intercepted them, then turned its attention to Syrian and Jordanian air bases. By the end of the first day, Arab air power had effectively ceased to exist. Israel had won total air superiority. For the tank formations in Sinai, this meant catastrophe. Soviet doctrine assumed air cover. Egyptian tank commanders had trained under the assumption that Soviet-supplied MiG fighters would protect them. Instead, they found themselves naked under hostile skies. Israeli Fouga Magister trainers, pressed into service as ground attack aircraft, strafed Egyptian columns. Mystère and Super Mystère fighters rocketed tank formations. Without air defense, without air support, the Egyptian armor was reduced to hiding, moving only at night, hoping to survive until orders arrived. But the real devastation would come from Israeli armor, not Israeli aircraft. Major General Ariel Sharon commanded the 38th Armored Division. He was 39 years old, already a legend in Israeli military circles, known for aggressive tactics and a willingness to ignore orders he considered stupid. In early June, he received his objective: break through Egyptian defenses at Katef and Abu Agela, opening the road to central Sinai. The Egyptians had spent years fortifying Katef. It was a natural choke point where three roads converged. Holding it meant controlling access to the Mitla Pass and the roads to the Suez Canal. The Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division defended the position with 16,000 men, 66 T-34-85 tanks, 22 Su-100 tank destroyers, and extensive artillery. They had built 3 parallel trench lines stretching 5 kilometers, each heavily fortified with bunkers, minefields, and interlocking fields of fire. The defensive plan was classically Soviet: let the enemy attack, absorb their assault in the defensive lines, counterattack with armor once they're exhausted. It had worked at Kursk in 1943 when German armor bled itself white against Soviet defenses. Soviet advisors believed it would work in Sinai. Sharon looked at the defenses and developed a plan that would become a textbook example of combined arms warfare. He would attack with 5 different elements simultaneously, each supporting the others, overwhelming Egyptian command and control. First, Israeli artillery would bombard the Egyptian trenches, forcing defenders to keep their heads down. Second, paratroopers would helicopter behind Egyptian lines, locating and destroying Egyptian artillery positions so they couldn't fire on advancing Israeli forces. Third, infantry battalions would assault the trench lines directly, fixing Egyptian defenders in place. Fourth, combat engineers would clear paths through the minefields under cover of darkness. Fifth, once the minefields were cleared, Sharon's armor would pour through, destroying Egyptian tanks and exploiting into their rear areas. The coordination required was extraordinary. Everything had to happen in sequence, precisely timed, or the whole plan would collapse. If the Egyptian artillery wasn't silenced, it would slaughter Israeli infantry. If the minefields weren't cleared, Israeli tanks would be sitting ducks. If the infantry didn't pin Egyptian forces, they could maneuver to meet Israeli armor on favorable terms. 10:45 p.m., June 5th. Israeli artillery opened fire. 150 guns, firing in coordination, walked shells across Egyptian positions. The bombardment was deliberate, designed not to destroy but to suppress, to force Egyptian soldiers to shelter in bunkers rather than man their weapons. Simultaneously, Israeli helicopters flew nap of the earth toward Egyptian artillery positions. Paratroopers rappelled into the darkness, located Soviet-supplied artillery pieces, and attacked with explosives and small arms. Confused Egyptian artillerymen fought back, but in the chaos and darkness, they couldn't coordinate effective resistance. One by one, the guns fell silent. At the trench lines, Israeli infantry advanced. This was brutal, close-quarters combat, soldiers with rifles and grenades against entrenched defenders. The Egyptians fought hard. They had good positions, overlapping fields of fire, artillery support, until the paratroopers silenced it. But they also faced soldiers who knew this was existential combat. Israeli infantry pushed forward through casualties, grenade by grenade, bunker by bunker. Behind them, combat engineers worked in the minefields. These were specialists, trained to detect and neutralize Soviet anti-tank mines under fire. They marked safe paths with tape, working by moonlight and muzzle flash. Occasionally a mine detonated, killing the engineer. Another would take his place. By 3 a.m. on June 6th, they had cleared enough lanes for armor to pass. Sharon gave the order. 150 tanks, Centurions in the lead, Super Shermans and AMX-13s following, advanced through the minefield lanes. Egyptian commanders realized what was happening and ordered their T-34s and Su-100s to engage. But the Israeli armor had advantages beyond their guns. Israeli crews had night vision equipment, rudimentary by modern standards, but far superior to Soviet-supplied optics. Israeli tank commanders operated with their heads out of the turret, giving them better situational awareness than buttoned-up Egyptian crews. The engagement was devastatingly one-sided. Israeli Centurions engaged Egyptian armor at ranges where the T-34's 85mm gun was ineffective. The L7 105mm gun punched through T-34 frontal armor with ease. Egyptian tanks brewed up, ammunition cooking off in spectacular fireballs. The Su-100 tank destroyers, with their powerful 100mm guns, might have been dangerous, but they were essentially tanks without turrets, unable to engage targets outside their forward arc. Israeli tanks maneuvered around them, firing into their thin side armor. By 6 a.m. on June 6th, Katef and Abu Agela were in Israeli hands. The Egyptian 2nd Infantry Division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Casualties were staggering. Over 4,000 Egyptian soldiers killed, 40 armored vehicles destroyed or captured. Israeli losses were significant but sustainable. 19 tanks destroyed, 40 dead. But more importantly, Sharon had shattered the myth of Soviet defensive doctrine. The Egyptians had fought well individually, but their command structure had collapsed under the complexity of the Israeli assault. Egyptian radios were overwhelmed with conflicting reports. Officers couldn't coordinate responses fast enough. The rigid Soviet system, which worked brilliantly when executing planned operations, fell apart when faced with a multi-axis attack that didn't follow the expected pattern. While Sharon was breaking through Katef, another engagement demonstrated the raw superiority of Israeli gunnery and equipment. Brigadier General Shmuel Gonen commanded an armored brigade advancing south through Sinai toward Bir Lafan, a fortified Egyptian position blocking the coastal road. Egyptian intelligence reported Israeli armor approaching. They deployed 32 T-54 and T-55 tanks to meet the threat. These were not the older T-34s that had fought at Abu Agela. These were the modern Soviet medium tanks, the ones that were supposed to be superior to anything Israel fielded. Gonen's force numbered only 20 Centurion Schott tanks. A standard military textbook would suggest the defender with superior numbers in prepared positions should win, particularly when the opposing forces were supposedly equivalent in capability. The textbook was wrong. The engagement occurred in relatively open desert, with good visibility. Israeli Centurions detected the Egyptian formation at approximately 3,000 meters. Israeli tank commanders immediately ordered their gunners to engage. The Centurions halted, stabilizing their aim. At 3,000 meters, Israeli crews had practiced this shot hundreds of times. They knew the range estimation, the sight picture, the ballistics of the L7 gun. The first volley destroyed 6 Egyptian tanks. The armor-piercing, discarding sabot rounds, traveling at over 1,000 meters per second, punched through T-55 turret armor as if it were cardboard. Egyptian crews didn't understand what was happening. They were being hit from distances their guns couldn't effectively respond. They attempted to close the range, accelerating toward the Israeli position. This was exactly the wrong response. Moving tanks are harder to aim from, and the Egyptian closing maneuver brought them into an engagement range where every Israeli tank could fire with devastating accuracy. The next volley destroyed 8 more Egyptian tanks. Now Egyptian commanders understood they were in a killing zone. Some tanks attempted to retreat. Others tried to find hull-down positions. A few attempted to return fire, lobbing 100mm shells that fell short or wide. Israeli Centurions advanced methodically, maintaining range, firing precisely. Israeli doctrine emphasized hitting with the first shot. One shot, one kill wasn't just a slogan. It was drilled into every gunner until it became reflexive. Egyptian crews, trained in Soviet schools, had learned to fire multiple rounds at a target, walking shots onto target through observation. But you can't walk shots if your tank is already burning from the first incoming round. The engagement lasted less than 30 minutes. When it ended, all 32 Egyptian tanks were destroyed or disabled. Israeli losses, 0. Not a single Centurion was significantly damaged. Some had been hit by Egyptian fire, but T-55 rounds at extreme range lacked the penetration to defeat Centurion frontal armor. Gonen's brigade continued south. Word of the engagement spread through Israeli armored units. Morale soared. The Soviet tanks weren't invincible. Israeli equipment, Israeli training, Israeli tactics were superior. In Egyptian units, the opposite occurred. Tank crews who had believed they operated the finest Soviet equipment began to understand they were outmatched. The psychological impact was devastating. Egyptian morale, already shaken by the loss of air cover, began to collapse. When Israeli armor appeared on the horizon, some Egyptian crews abandoned their tanks rather than face another one-sided engagement. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational calculation. Soviet doctrine had trained these men to fight as part of a combined arms system, with air support and artillery. That system had disintegrated. Now they were being asked to face superior enemy tanks, with better guns and better trained crews, without support. The mathematics of survival suggested running. By the end of the second day, Israeli armored columns were racing across Sinai. The Egyptian defensive strategy had collapsed. Units that might have conducted organized retreats instead broke into panicked withdrawals. Soviet advisors, watching their doctrine disintegrate, urged Egyptian commanders to establish new defensive lines. But Israeli armor didn't give them time. Wherever Egyptians tried to establish positions, Israeli forces would appear, often from unexpected directions, and shatter them. The Battle of Sinai became a pursuit, Israeli tanks chasing fleeing Egyptian columns. Israeli aircraft, having destroyed Egyptian air power, devoted themselves to ground attack. The roads leading west toward the Suez Canal became shooting galleries. Egyptian tanks, trucks, and armored personnel carriers fled in long columns, perfect targets for Israeli aircraft and pursuing armor. On June 8th, Israeli forces reached the Suez Canal. In 72 hours, they had crossed the entire Sinai Peninsula. The speed was unprecedented in modern warfare. During World War II, major offensives measured their advances in kilometers per day. Israeli armor had advanced nearly 300 kilometers in 3 days, while simultaneously engaging and destroying Egyptian forces. The cost to Egypt was catastrophic. Of 950 Egyptian tanks that entered the war, only about 130 survived intact. Over 820 tanks were destroyed, captured, or abandoned in the desert. The Israelis methodically recovered the abandoned vehicles. Some had been set afire by their crews. Others sat in perfect working order, fuel tanks full, ammunition loaded, simply left behind when crews fled. Among the captured vehicles were dozens of T-55s. Israeli intelligence officers examined them with fascination. The Soviet tanks were well designed in many respects. The sloped armor was elegant. The engine was reliable. The gun, though inferior to the L-7, was still potent. But the internal layout horrified Israeli tankers who inspected them. The cramped crew compartment made loading and firing slow compared to Western designs. The optics were adequate but not excellent. The ammunition storage, shells and charges stored separately, slowed the rate of fire. An Israeli Centurion crew could fire 8 to 10 aimed shots per minute. A T-55 crew, even well-trained, struggled to fire 4. But the most critical flaw was one the Soviets had never corrected. The T-55 lacked a sophisticated fire control system. Hitting targets required estimating range by eye, adjusting for wind and temperature mentally, and firing until you walked rounds onto the target. Against poorly trained opponents, or in mass engagements where volume of fire mattered more than precision, this was acceptable. Against highly trained Israeli crews with superior guns and better fire control, it was fatal. While Sinai burned, Israel faced a separate crisis on its northern border. Syria had shelled Israeli settlements from the Golan Heights for years. The heights were a volcanic plateau, rising nearly 300 meters above the Sea of Galilee, giving Syria a commanding position. Syrian artillery could hit Israeli farms and towns with impunity. Israel had endured this because attacking the heights meant a bloody uphill assault against prepared positions. But with Egypt defeated and Jordan's army battered after fighting around Jerusalem, Israel had an opportunity. On June 9th, Israeli forces attacked the Golan Heights. The Syrian defensive position was formidable. They had constructed extensive fortifications, reinforced bunkers, minefields, anti-tank ditches. They deployed over 260 T-54 and T-55 tanks on the heights, positioned in hull-down positions where only their turrets were exposed. Syrian commanders believed the terrain made them invulnerable. An attacking force would have to climb narrow roads under fire, exposed to Syrian guns the entire time. Israeli planners knew frontal assault would be costly. Instead, they combined infantry assaults to clear Syrian positions with armored exploitation once breaches were created. Israeli combat engineers used bulldozers, working under fire, to fill anti-tank ditches and clear obstacles. Infantry squads attacked Syrian bunkers with flamethrowers and satchel charges. It was brutal, attritional combat that seemed more like World War I than modern mechanized warfare. But once Israeli tanks reached the plateau, the battle's character changed. Syrian armor attempted to counterattack, using their numerical advantage to swarm Israeli positions. But the same problems that had destroyed Egyptian armor appeared on the Golan. Syrian crews, trained in Soviet doctrine, advanced in formation. Israeli tanks picked them off at range. Syrian tanks that closed successfully found that Israeli centurions, even outnumbered, had thicker armor and more powerful guns. The psychological impact of Israel's victory in Sinai also affected Syrian forces. Syrian tank crews had heard what happened to Egyptian armor. When Syrian tanks started brewing up under Israeli fire, morale cracked. Some Syrian units fought with desperate courage, understanding this was their homeland. Others broke and retreated. By June 10th, Israeli forces controlled the Golan Heights. Syrian casualties were staggering. Syria had lost over 1,000 tanks, including at least 600 T-54 and T-55s. Israel had suffered as well, losing around 250 tanks on the Syrian front, a much higher ratio than in Sinai because of the terrain advantages Syria possessed. But the strategic result was overwhelming. Israel now controlled the heights, and Syrian artillery could no longer threaten Israeli settlements. When the ceasefire took effect on June 10th, the scope of Arab armored losses became clear. Egypt had lost over 820 tanks. Syria had lost over 1,100. Jordan had lost its entire armored force. The combined total exceeded 2,000 tanks, destroyed, damaged, or captured in 6 days of fighting. The Soviets were humiliated. Their equipment, their doctrine, their training, all had failed catastrophically. Oleg Kalugin, then a KGB officer and later a defector, remembered the mood in Moscow. No one doubted that Israel would be rapidly defeated. Instead, Soviet client states had been crushed so completely that it called into question Soviet military competence. The Soviet response was immediate and massive. Antonov transport aircraft began landing in Cairo and Damascus within days of the ceasefire, carrying replacement equipment. Over the next year, the Soviet Union would replace virtually all Arab tank losses, along with new aircraft, artillery, and SAM systems. But the replacements came with a message. The equipment wasn't the problem. The problem was how it was used. Soviet military advisors conducted extensive after-action reviews. They identified multiple failures. Arab crews had poor gunnery skills compared to Israeli crews. Arab commanders had been too rigid, unable to adapt when Israeli forces didn't behave as Soviet doctrine predicted. Arab armies had failed to maintain combined arms coordination. Most critically, losing air superiority on the first day had doomed everything that followed. But the Soviets didn't acknowledge the deeper problem. Soviet doctrine had evolved to fight NATO in Central Europe, where Soviet forces would have numerical superiority, air superiority, and the advantage of massed artillery. Exporting that doctrine to the Middle East, where Arab states didn't possess those advantages, was fundamentally flawed. The Arabs couldn't simply copy Soviet methods. They needed to adapt those methods to their own circumstances, capabilities, and enemy. For Israel, the captured tanks presented an opportunity and an ironic solution. Hundreds of abandoned T-54 and T-55 tanks sat in Sinai, many in perfect working order. Israeli ordnance experts examined them and made a decision that must have delighted someone's sense of humor. They would restore the captured Soviet tanks to service, modify them for Israeli use, and employ them against the armies that had fielded them. The modifications were extensive. Israeli engineers ripped out the Soviet 100mm D-10T cannon and replaced it with the same British L-7 105mm gun that had destroyed them. They upgraded the fire control systems with Israeli electronics. They replaced Soviet radios with Israeli communications equipment. They modified the ammunition storage to reduce fire hazards. They even installed Israeli diesel engines in some variants, improving reliability and parts commonality with other Israeli vehicles. The redesignated tanks received a Hebrew name, Tiran. The name was deliberately chosen for its multiple meanings. In Hebrew, it meant tyrant, a reference to Stalin and Soviet domination. But it also referenced the Straits of Tiran, the closure of which had been the immediate casus belli for the war. The captured Soviet tanks, renamed for the strategic choke point that had sparked the war, modified with the weapons that had defeated them, would now serve Israel. The irony deepened in 1969 during Operation Raviv. Israeli forces launched a raid across the Suez Canal, using captured T-55 Tyran tanks in the assault. Egyptian defenders, seeing T-55 silhouettes through their optics, assumed the tanks were friendly and hesitated to fire. By the time they realized their mistake, Israeli commandos had achieved their objectives and were withdrawing. The Egyptians had been deceived by their own equipment, modified and turned against them. The Tyran tanks would serve in Israeli armored units for decades. During the 1973 Yom Kippur War, when Egypt and Syria launched surprise attacks that restored their military credibility, Tiran tanks fought alongside Centurions and new Israeli-designed Merkava tanks. Some remained in reserve service into the 1980s. A tank designed in the Soviet Union to fight NATO ended its service life in Israeli hands, fighting Arab armies, modified with British guns, a mechanical metaphor for the complex politics of Cold War proxy conflicts. The Six-Day War transformed the Middle East's political landscape. Israel tripled its territory, controlling Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. The territorial conquests would define Arab-Israeli conflict for the next 50 years, creating occupied populations, intractable disputes, and cycles of violence that continue today. But militarily, the war demonstrated principles that transcended its specific circumstances. First, the quality of individual soldiers and crews matters more than equipment specifications. The T-55 was not a bad tank. In many respects, it was a solid design, reliable and effective. But operated by poorly trained crews following rigid doctrine against superbly trained opponents, it was helpless. Israeli tank crews spent hundreds of hours on gunnery ranges because their commanders understood that the first shot in an engagement often determined the outcome. Egyptian and Syrian crews had adequate training by most standards, but adequate wasn't enough against excellent. Second, air superiority is prerequisite for modern armored warfare. Soviet doctrine assumed air cover. Remove that assumption, and the entire system collapsed. Egyptian tanks in Sinai spent as much effort hiding from Israeli aircraft as fighting Israeli armor. Syrian tanks on the Golan retreated when Israeli jets appeared, even when ground combat was going favorably. The psychological impact of enemy aircraft orbiting overhead, knowing they could strike at any moment, paralyzed decision-making and destroyed morale. Third, combined arms coordination requires practice and flexibility. Sharon's assault on Abu Aguila worked because 5 different elements, artillery, airborne infantry, ground infantry, engineers and armor, all executed precisely timed maneuvers. That level of coordination came from extensive training and commanders empowered to make decisions. Soviet doctrine emphasized coordination too, but it was centralized coordination, with higher headquarters directing movements. When Israeli attacks disrupted Egyptian command posts, Egyptian units couldn't adapt. Fourth, quantity has a quality of its own, but only if you can bring that quantity to bear effectively. The Arabs had more tanks, more men, more guns. But Egyptian armor in Sinai was divided between defensive positions and mobile reserves, never concentrated for decisive action. Syrian armor on the Golan was tied to static defense. Neither side managed to mass their numerical superiority against Israeli forces. Israeli doctrine, by contrast, emphasized concentration at the decisive point. Israeli commanders would strip other sectors to achieve local superiority, trusting speed and mobility to prevent enemies from exploiting the weakened areas. Fifth, technology matters, but not in the way most people assume. The L7 gun gave Israeli tanks a range advantage, which was important. But the advantage was measured in hundreds of meters, not thousands. What mattered more was the training to use that advantage, the fire control systems that helped crews hit at range, the doctrine that emphasized first-round hits. Technology is a force multiplier, but it multiplies the capability of the soldiers using it. Give a sophisticated weapon to a poorly trained soldier, and you waste the weapon. The Six-Day War also demonstrated the limitations of exported military doctrine. Soviet methods worked for the Soviet military because they were designed around Soviet strengths and Soviet circumstances. The Red Army had massive reserves of manpower, industrial production capacity to replace losses quickly, and a military culture that accepted high casualties in pursuit of objectives. Arab armies had none of these advantages. They had limited populations, limited industrial capacity, and political systems where military defeats could topple governments. Applying Soviet doctrine without adapting it to these differences was a recipe for disaster. For the United States and NATO, the Six-Day War provided both reassurance and warning. The reassurance was that Soviet equipment, operated by Soviet-trained crews, could be defeated decisively. The warning was that the circumstances of the Middle East bore little resemblance to what NATO would face in Central Europe. If war came in Europe, NATO wouldn't have air superiority. Soviet forces would have numerical superiority and the advantage of surprise. The tactics that worked for Israel might not work for NATO. The war also had profound effects on military procurement and doctrine. Western armies studied Israeli tactics obsessively. The emphasis on crew training increased. Gunnery standards rose. The importance of combined arms coordination was reinforced. American and British tank designers looked at the effectiveness of the L7 gun and confirmed that the next generation of tanks needed even more powerful weapons. This would lead to the British L11 120mm gun and the German Rheinmetall 120mm smoothbore, weapons that would define tank armament for the next 40 years. Soviet designers also learned, though their lessons were different. They recognized that the T-55, while reliable and mass-producible, was outmatched by advanced NATO tanks with superior fire control and guns. This led to the development of the T-62, T-64, and eventually the T-72, each incorporating lessons from the Six-Day War. Soviet doctrine evolved to place even greater emphasis on air defense and on rapid, overwhelming offensives that wouldn't give the enemy time to exploit superior training. For tank warfare specifically, the Six-Day War demonstrated that the era of mass tank formations deciding wars through armored clashes, à la Kursk or Normandy, was ending. Modern anti-tank weapons, from fighter aircraft to guided missiles to superior tank guns, made large armored formations increasingly vulnerable. The future belonged to smaller, more sophisticated armored units operating with better coordination, better intelligence, and better integration with air power. These lessons would be tested again in 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched carefully planned offensives that caught Israel by surprise. The Yom Kippur War would show that Arab armies could learn, adapt, and apply new tactics effectively. Egyptian forces, using Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles and improved air defense systems, would inflict heavy casualties on Israeli armor in the war's opening days. Syrian tanks would come close to breaking through Israeli defenses on the Golan Heights. The 1973 war would be a far closer thing than the Six-Day War, demonstrating that the military balance in the Middle East was not permanently settled. But in June 1967, as Israeli soldiers stood beside captured T-55 tanks in the Sinai sand, those future battles were unimaginable. What seemed clear was that the myth of Soviet invincibility had been shattered. The tank that was supposed to be unstoppable had been stopped. The doctrine that was supposed to be unbeatable had been beaten. The quantity that was supposed to overwhelm had been outmaneuvered and destroyed. The T-55 would go on to fight in dozens of conflicts around the world. It would serve in Vietnam, in Africa, in the Middle East, in Afghanistan. Over 50 countries would operate it. Some nations still field T-55 variants today, over 60 years after the tank first entered service. By any measure, it was a successful design, arguably the most significant tank of the Cold War era in terms of global impact. But its reputation would never recover from those 6 days in June 1967, when Israeli tankers proved that confidence without competence is just arrogance, that numbers without training are just targets, and that the finest equipment in the world is worthless in the wrong hands, following the wrong doctrine against the wrong enemy. The lessons remain relevant. Modern military analysts studying great power conflict look at the Six-Day War and see principles that transcend technology. Training matters, doctrine matters, air power matters, leadership matters. The side that can adapt faster, train better, coordinate more effectively, and empower its frontline commanders will have enormous advantages over the side with more equipment following rigid doctrine. In an era when advanced weapons proliferate globally, when drones and missiles and cyber weapons dominate headlines, it's worth remembering that war remains fundamentally human. Machines don't fight wars. People fight wars using machines. The side with better people, better training, better leadership, and better doctrine will usually defeat the side with more machines but inferior human capital. The captured T-55 tanks that became tyrants, modified with the weapons that defeated them, serving the nation they were meant to destroy, represent a profound irony. But they also represent a deeper truth. In war, as in life, it's not what you have that matters most. It's what you do with it.